So if you want to get out Genesis 25 while I do this. Two reflections, and probably specifically on singleness. I think some of the last few talks was about that. I'm married with kids, and so I was thinking back to my time of singleness, and I was a bit disappointed with my past self. I was living my life like a version of I'm a celebrity, get me out of here. It was like I'm a single, get me out of here. And I look back and I see myself not taking the Bible seriously to actually consider whether that was for me or not. My other reflection is I've just been really encouraged by the single people around me who are taking that seriously, and how they're considering how they could be living completely for God and using community around them to fulfill all of those other relational kind of inputs. And so that's been really encouraging. So I'm going to be reading Genesis 25, 19 through to the end. This is the account of the family line of Abraham's son, Isaac. Abraham became the father of Isaac, and Isaac was 40 years old when he married Rebekah, daughter of Bethuel the Aramean from Paddan Aram, and sister of Laban the Aramean. Isaac prayed to the Lord on behalf of his wife because she was childless. The Lord answered his prayer, and his wife Rebekah became pregnant. The babies jostled each other within her, and she said, "Why is this happening to me?" So she went to inquire of the Lord. The Lord said to her, "Two nations are in your womb, and two peoples from within you will be separated. One people will be stronger than the other, and the older will serve the younger." When the time came for her to give birth, there were twin boys in her womb. The first to come out was red, and his whole body was like a hairy garment, so they named him Esau. After this, his brother came out, with his hand grasping Esau's heel, so he was named Jacob. Isaac was 60 years old when Rebekah gave birth to them. The boys grew up, and Esau became a skillful hunter, a man of the open country, while Jacob was content to stay at home among the tents. Isaac, who had a taste for wild game, loved Esau, but Rebekah loved Jacob. Once, when Jacob was cooking some stew, Esau came in from the open country famished. He said to Jacob, "Quick, let me have some of that red stew, I'm famished." That is why he was also called Edom. Jacob replied, "First, sell me your birthright." "Look, I'm about to die," Esau said. "What good is the birthright to me?" But Jacob said, "Swear to me first." So he swore an oath to him, selling his birthright to Jacob. Then Jacob gave Esau some bread and some lentil stew. He ate and drank, and then got up and left. So Esau despised his birthright.
Thanks, Paul. During our first year living in Southeast Asia, there was a moment when a Muslim friend, offered to take me somewhere on his motorbike. And before I climbed on to sit behind him, he offered me his spare motorbike helmet. But as I put it on, I realised that the clip that fastens the straps that go under the chin was broken. And now I felt a bit anxious about weaving through the traffic at high speeds without a helmet properly strapped onto my head. So I said, "The clip seems to be broken." And he stared at me as if what I had said made absolutely no sense at all. So I tried it again. I said, "The clip, it's broken." And he just kept staring. And I said, "It's not very safe." And he went, And he said, "Derek, you need to understand that in this country, we don't wear helmets for safety, we wear them to avoid getting a fine." And sure enough, I looked at him and I could see that his helmet had the straps just sort of blowing gently in the wind, even though his clip didn't even seem to be broken. And so I said, "But what if you have an accident? You could die." And what I really meant was, what if we have an accident? I could die. And he paused again and thought for a moment, and then he looked me in the eye and he said with great seriousness, Derek, if Allah in his sovereignty has determined that I should die today, nothing that I do, clipping a helmet onto my head or anything else, nothing can change that. So I climbed on, my helmet strapped, blowing in the wind, and we headed off into the traffic. And as I, at a very practical level, felt compelled to embrace his version of God's sovereignty, I found myself wondering about it theologically. I mean, I believe that God is sovereign too. I believe we live in a world ruled by a sovereign God too. Why then do I want to strap the helmet onto my head and this guy doesn't? I realised that our little interchange about helmet straps had raised a profound question. See, if our world is ruled by a sovereign God, what does that mean for how we live? Does it even matter how we live? Well, today's text raises this very question because in this story of Jacob and Esau, we discover in verse 23 that their fate is determined before they even leave the womb. See, while the twins are still jostling in the womb, the sovereign God declares what's going to become of them. That these two boys will become two nations and that the older will serve the younger. And so it raises a big question. If God determines the outcome before they're even born, before, as the Apostle Paul will later write in Romans 9, before the twins were born or had done anything good or bad, if that's the case, does it even matter what they do? Does it even matter how they live? It raises this question. In a world ruled by a sovereign God, how should we live? Does it even matter how we live? See, that is the question that we are going to ask of our text today, Genesis 25. And what we're going to see is that, yes, it does matter how we live. In fact, the sovereign God cares very much how we live. He cares so much that he's given us this text to teach us, to train us as to how we should live in a world which he sovereignly rules. Let's dive in. Now, if we're going to understand Genesis 25, we need to take a moment to recap the story so far. The Jacob and Esau story makes no sense unless we understand what's come before, and particularly the momentous events of Genesis 12. So let's go there. Genesis 12. This comes at a time when the world seemed lost. Lost in brokenness, lost in death, in conflict, in curse. And then in Genesis 12, God had made this promise to Abram. And it was a promise to bless. Genesis 12, I will make you into a great nation and I will bless you. I will make your name great and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. So this momentous promise shapes the book of Genesis. It will shape the life of Jacob. It shapes the history of the world because it's a promise from the sovereign God to restore the world, to replace curse with blessing. And it's a promise to do that through a chosen line, a chosen people who will be blessed in order to be a blessing. People who will be blessed in order that God's missional plan might be carried out through them. All peoples on earth will be blessed through you. So that was the momentous promise back in Genesis 12. Given to Abraham, and Genesis 12 to 25 traces the story of Abraham learning how to live as a bearer of the promise, the one who's blessed to be a blessing. That was Abraham's journey of learning to live by faith in pursuit of the promise. That's what's come before us. That's Genesis 12 to 25. And now we're picking it up this semester. Abraham's death has just been narrated at the beginning of the chapter, And now the focus shifts to Abraham's descendants, and particularly to his grandsons, Jacob and Esau. So the question is, how will they go? Will they learn, as Abraham did, how to live in a world ruled by a sovereign God? How to live as bearers of the promise? How to live by faith in pursuit of that promise? Let's find out how they go. The story starts in verses 19 and 20 with a bit of a recap of the family tree. We're reminded that we've got Abraham, the promise bearer, and then his son Isaac, and Isaac's wife Rebekah. And now the focus is going to shift to the third generation. Verse 21, we'll pick it up. Verse 21, Isaac prayed to the Lord on behalf of his wife because she was childless. The Lord answered his prayer, and his wife Rebekah became pregnant. The babies jostled each other within her. And we'll just pause there because I want you to notice that the narrator has just subtly dropped a very big issue into that sentence. Remember what we're doing. We're tracing the line of the promise bearer. But when Rebekah falls pregnant, it's not a baby, singular. It's babies, plural. They're twins. Oh dear. This is raising a big question now. If there's two of them, which one is going to inherit the promise? Which one's going to inherit the blessing? Which one will be the one through whom God carries out his missional plan? And it's almost as if these two yet-to-be-born babies understand that there's a contest. They jostle each other within her, verse 22. And in the Hebrew, the word that's used for jostle is a very strong term. It's a very violent term. It get used in Judges to depict the smashing of skulls. Okay, so there's some serious sibling rivalry going on inside Rebekah's womb. It's a battle to inherit the promise, a battle to be the firstborn, to obtain the blessing of God. It's a high-intensity moment we have here with these two babies thrashing it out between themselves as if they could determine their fate through their own jostling, through their own human effort, as if they could settle the outcome. It's such a vigorous jostle that Rebekah is in agony, verse 22. She said, "Why is this happening to me?" So she went to inquire of the Lord. Verse 23, the Lord said to her, 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples from within you will be separated. One people will be stronger than the other, and the older will serve the younger. Spoiler alert, the sovereign God gives away the ending before the movie has even got going. And as we saw back at the start, he's already determined the outcome before these twins are born. What is this outcome? Well, these 2 babies, they're going to become 2 nations, and they're going to divide, they're going to separate. And contrary to expectation, contrary to custom, to tradition, to law, it's going to be the younger one who's supreme. It's going to be the younger one who is served by the older. The younger one who's going to become the bearer of the Genesis 12 promise. Okay, let's summarize the situation to this point. We've got these twins of the promise-bearing family, and because they're twins, that creates this inheritance tension. Then we've got those twins battling it out in the womb as if they can determine the outcome. And then we've got the sovereign God declaring the outcome before it even begins. In a world ruled by a sovereign God, how should we live? How will these 2 children go at learning how to live under God's sovereign rule? Let's keep reading and find out. Verse 24. When the time came for her to give birth, there were twin boys in her womb. The first to come out was red, and his whole body was like a hairy garment, so they named him Esau. After that, his brother came out, with his hand grasping Esau's heel. So he was named Jacob. So they're born, and we learn something about both of them. First of all, Esau, he's hairy. His whole body, it says, was like a hairy garment. Just think of that picture. It makes him sound like an animal, isn't it? Is that what the author wants us to think about Esau? Well, we'll find out as we keep reading in a moment. But for now, that's Esau. What about Jacob? Well, we discover that Jacob is a grasper. Comes out of the womb grasping his brother's heel. Could he be any more invested in this sibling rivalry? Even at the moment of birth, he's at work. He's trying to take his brother's place as the firstborn, as if by his own effort, by his own schemes, he could take hold of the promised blessing. So we've got hairy one, we've got heel grabber, and they get names accordingly, don't they? Esau, which means hairy, and Jacob, which is a play on the word heel and implies heel grabber. So how will hairy one and grasping heel grabber, how will they go at learning how to live in a world ruled by a sovereign God? Keep reading to find out. Verse 27. The boys grew up and Esau became a skillful hunter, a man of the open country, while Jacob was content to stay at home among the tents. Isaac, who had a taste for wild game, loved Esau, but Rebekah loved Jacob. Now, don't forget, back in verse 23, the sovereign God declared that there would be division between these two, that they would separate, leading us to expect some kind of conflict, some kind of competition. And here we see that the conditions are indeed building for some kind of a showdown. As the twins grow up, they grow in very different directions, don't they? Hairy becomes an open country hunter, heel grabber stays at home. And not only are they different, but mum and dad are playing favourites. And mum and dad are dividing over who they choose as their favourite. Isaac loves hairy, Rebekah loves heel grabber. And so the stage is set for a battle. And it breaks out in verse 29. Once, when Jacob was cooking some stew, Esau came in from the open country famished. He said to Jacob, "Quick, let me have some of that red stew. I'm famished." Hairy behaves in an animal-like way. He's impulsive. He's driven by his immediate cravings. He's almost grunting his demands. A more literal translation of verse 30 might read something like this: "Give me a gulp of that red stuff." And the word for gulp means to feed an animal by putting food into its mouth. So how does heel grabber respond to hairy one's demand? Verse 31. "First, sell me your birthright." Doesn't miss an opportunity, does he? Talk about seizing the moment. Now, a birthright, what that means is it means the rights and privileges of being the firstborn. It would have meant inheriting a double portion of the family's fortune. It also would have meant taking over from the father as the leader of the family. And so here, heel-grabbing Jacob, who's been grasping after the firstborn privileges ever since he was inside his mother's womb, as if getting it depended entirely on him, on his own schemes and tricks and hard work, heel-grabbing Jacob takes this moment to strike when his brother is famished. Yeah, I'll give you some stew, brother, but sell me your birthright first. Hairy responds in verse 32, "Look, I'm about to die. What good is a birthright to me?" Just like an animal, Esau lives in the moment. He can't see past his immediate stomach-related needs. As one writer puts it, Esau the animal arrives to feed, and Esau the hunter falls into a trap. Now, one of the things about animals is animals don't make 5-year plans. They don't know how to defer gratification of an immediate impulse in order that they might, at some future point, take hold of something of far greater value. They can't do that. They don't know how to do that. And neither, it seems, does Esau. And when it comes to pursuing the Genesis 12 promise, that is a very grave sin indeed. Let's keep going. Verse 33. But Jacob said, "Swear to me first." This devious heel grabber is going to make sure of it. He's striking while the iron is hot, or more accurately, while the hairy one is hungry. And he gets what he wants, doesn't he, in verse 33? It says, "So he, Esau, swore on oath to him, selling his birthright to Jacob. Then Jacob gave Esau some bread and some lentil stew. He ate and drank, and then he got up and left. So Esau despised his birthright." This story ends with 5 blunt, clipped verbs that just appear in a row. And this verbally completes the picture of Esau as behaving as a short-sighted animal. He ate, he drank, and he got up, and he left, and he despised. He despised his birthright. Let's return to our question. In a world ruled by a sovereign God, how should we live? How have these two men gone? Let's start with Esau. Esau sold his birthright for a bowl of lentil stew. It's pretty rare for the author of Genesis to make an explicit evaluation. Usually he's more subtle. Usually the critiques are implied. We're left to join the dots ourselves. But here he brings the hammer down hard on Esau, doesn't he? Esau despised his birthright. Whatever Esau has done, it's very serious. Why? Well, the key to living well in a world ruled by a sovereign God is acknowledging what that sovereign God is up to, what he's doing in the world, and then getting in step with that. What is that? What is it that the sovereign God is doing in the world? Well, we know from Genesis 12, he's on a mission to bless all peoples, a mission which he has communicated through a promise. So the key to living well in a world ruled by a sovereign God is to pursue that promise. That's the answer to our question. That's how to live in a world ruled by a sovereign God, by pursuing the promise. With that promise at the center of our lives, treasuring that promise as a most valuable thing, a most precious thing. Esau despised it. He despised the promise. He held it in contempt. What good is a birthright to me? He valued it so little that he traded it away for a bowl of lentils. In a world ruled by a sovereign God, it is a serious mistake indeed to despise and disdain what that sovereign God is doing. To despise and disdain the promise. Tragically, that is what Esau does, and his example cries out through history, even to us here today, as a warning not to do the same thing. First time I ever set foot on this campus was way back in the 1990s when I was still a teenager, and the pastor of my church in Armidale organised a field trip to SMBC and to Moore College so that we might hear about possibilities and think about future study and ministry. Now, I had absolutely no interest in ministry whatsoever at that time, but I went on the trip for social reasons. And I remember sitting in the SMBC dining hall over there, eating lunch with a student at the time. The student said to me, "Look, maybe one day you'll come and study here and then go into ministry." And I smiled and said, "Yeah, maybe." And that was a very polite outward response. But I can tell you that inwardly, I was thinking, no way. No way would I want to spend my life doing something like that. At that point in my life, I had an Esau attitude to the promise. Not because I didn't want to go to Bible college. There's plenty of ways that we can pursue the promise apart from going to Bible college. But what lay behind my internal no way was that I, at that point, didn't care about the promise at all. I had no intention of shaping my life around the promise, around what God is doing, God's mission. I had my own completely different agenda. I had an Esau attitude to the promise. I was planning to trade it away. How about you? Is that you? Are you planning your future, planning your life with disregard for the promise, for God's missional Genesis 12 plan? You know, I suspect for most of us here, total disregard for the promise isn't actually where you're at. I mean, after all, you've come to SMBC. This is a place that exists to train people to pursue the promise. But even so, there's still a warning here in Esau's example for you, for all of us today. Have a look at how the writer to the Hebrews warns us from the example of Esau. Hebrews 12 verse 16, see that no one is sexually immoral or is godless like Esau, who for a single meal sold his inheritance rights as the oldest son. Afterward, as you know, when he wanted to inherit this blessing, he was rejected. Even though he sought the blessing with tears, he could not change what he had done. See, Esau acted as if the sovereign God had made no promise. And you think about it, if there's no promise from God on this, then it doesn't matter how we live. And yes, we're free to gratify our physical cravings, food, sex, whatever, at any cost. And that's what the animal like Esau did, and that's what we're in danger of doing too, putting immediate gratification of physical cravings ahead of the promise. Every time we're tempted to click on a link that will take us to a pornographic website. Every time we're tempted to pursue an inappropriate, God-dishonoring physical relationship. Every time we're tempted to chase after food or after luxury or after other pleasures at the expense of pursuing the promise. Whenever we're in those moments, the writer of Hebrews wants to say to us, remember Esau. Animal like Esau, who lacked the foresight, who lacked the faith to defer gratification for the sake of the promise. Esau, who asked, what good is a birthright to me? See, instead of pursuing the promise, Esau despised it. So that's Esau. What about Jacob? How does Jacob go in this story, learning to live in a world ruled by a sovereign God? If Esau's failing is that he doesn't pursue the promise, Jacob's failing is that he pursues it by human effort. Esau lives as if there was no promise from the sovereign God, whereas Jacob, as if the promise-making God is not sovereign. Back in the womb, he was jostling. At birth, he was heel-grasping, and now he's ruthlessly scheming to take hold of this birthright as if it's all up to him. Yes, he's pursuing the promise. Boy, is he pursuing the promise. He really wants that blessing, but he's pursuing it the wrong way. He's acting as if he needs to orchestrate it for himself when the sovereign God has already declared that it's his and that God will give it to him as a gift. And as we'll see this semester, that way of pursuing the promise leads to a lot of unnecessary striving and toil, grasping and angst, conflict and contention, both for Jacob and for Jacob's family. If Jacob's going to be a faithful promise bearer, covenant partner, the one through whom God carries out his missional plan, he's going to have to learn to receive the blessing as a gift from God at the time when God is ready to give it, instead of manipulating and grasping for it on his own timeline. He's going to have to learn what, in fact, his parents modeled for us at the start of this story, in today's story. Do you notice what Isaac did when Rebekah was childless? He didn't scheme. He didn't try to solve the problem in his own steam. He didn't even repeat the mistake of his father by trying to manufacture a solution by taking a concubine. Verse 21, it says he prayed. In fact, he prayed for 20 years. Did you notice that? Verse 20, it says that Isaac was 40 when they got married, and then verse 26, 60 when the twins were born. 20 years he prayed. 20 years he waited for God to fulfill the promise. And likewise, Rebekah, when she was in agony because of the jostling of these twins, what did she do? She prayed. 22, verse 22, she took it to the Lord. See, right here at the start of Jacob's story, we get a glimpse of the faith posture which Jacob is going to need to learn. That of abandoning the grasping and instead looking to God to provide, waiting for God to provide. See, that is how to live in a world ruled by a sovereign God, pursuing the promise by faith. It's what Jacob needs to learn, pursuing the promise by faith. And it's what this journey of Genesis 25 to 36 is going to be about. It's what we get to witness this semester. Jacob's development, his progress from grasping heel grabber to one who learns to pursue the promise by faith. And if we are willing, if we will open ourselves up to the work of the Holy Spirit in us, we won't just be witnessing his journey, but we'll be on it too. Because, brothers and sisters, this is something we need to learn too. We, after all, are inheritors of this promise, inheritors of this missional role. We live in a different era. We live in a time when God's missional plan has further unfolded, a time when we now know that he's fulfilling this promise through Christ, establishing this kingdom of blessing through Christ. We know that now, but just as back then, so too today, he's carrying it out through his chosen, blessed to be a blessing people, us. And just as back then, so too today, he communicates that plan to us through promise. And so what Jacob needed to learn then, we need to learn today to pursue this promise by faith. So how are you going at learning this? God's missional promise bearer as you are, how are you going as you pursue this promise? How are you going about pursuing the promise? Graspingly, self-reliantly, heel-grabbingly, or by faith, praying to God, depending on him, waiting on him? See, removing our grasping hands from the heel, from the birthright, from our own plans and schemes can be very hard. Depending on the invisible God who deals with his people, who answers prayers over the span of decades and lifetimes, that can be hard. Old Testament scholar Walter Brueggemann writes, promise requires an end to grasping and certitude and an embrace of precariousness. And I've got to be honest with you, I find embracing precariousness hard. When we first moved to Southeast Asia, our agency, OMF, lined us up to teach at a particular Bible college. What that college needed and what we thought we were able to do seemed like a perfect match. We were really excited to go there, and we moved to that city to learn language in order that we might transition into the college smoothly. But a few months before our language school year finished, the Bible college told us that because of government restrictions, they could no longer have me teach there as they'd planned and offer me a visa through them. I was devastated. This was the ministry we came to do. This was how we were pursuing the promise. And I remember I had this crisis conversation with our OMF supervisor, who was this American lady called Peggy. Now, Peggy had been serving in the country for over 30 years. She's one of those people you want to be like when you grow up. She was so full of experience and wisdom and godliness. And I turned to Peggy and I said to her, let's find a way around these government restrictions. I mean, I came here to teach at that college. There must be a way for us to make this work. And I remember her response very clearly. She said, Derek, This seems like a closed door. I think we should just wait and pray and see what God has planned for you and Anna. That was so hard for me. An end to grasping and certitude and embracing of precariousness. I wanted to be a Jacob. If that job at the Bible college was a heel, I wanted to grab it. If it was a birthright, I wanted to grasp it. But God, in his kindness, gave us the advice of a woman who, through 30 years of ministry experience, had learned many lessons of faith. I think we should wait, pray, see what God has planned. Well, Anna and I did live with the precariousness and the uncertainty for about 6 months. And it was hard. We'd come so far, and it felt for those months like we'd come here for nothing. But in his good time, God did open up another role at another college. And in the years that followed, God did some remarkable things at that second college, which we were blessed to witness and to participate in. It was his way, not ours. It was his timing, not ours. And as I look back, I realise we might have missed it altogether if it hadn't been for the advice of Peggy to pursue the promise by faith. Because that is how we are to live in a world ruled by a sovereign God.